everybody. Welcome to AppSecCali. I appreciate being invited to speak to you guys about offensive threat models for the supply chain. My name is Tony UcedaVelez. We're going to dive right in. I respect everyone's time, and I know you guys are hungry to kind of learn and see what I have to talk about here, so we're just going to dig in. Let's define what is the supply chain first. Let's define and understand that there is a downstream level of components of manufacturers, players that are building things from raw materials. They're building components that oftentimes get integrated into various industries that affect us all, from B2C, business to consumer services, to business services. Today we're going to focus on offensive threat models. So, oftentimes a good security person will live schizophrenically, where you have to think like a criminal, and you also have to think, like a white hat if you're trying to help an enterprise or your respective company. We're focusing on manufacturing, the impact of supply chain and security assurance to the manufacturers and then the distributors that go to an endpoint of that supply chain. Here's a little visualization here where we basically have some level of, let's take automation workflow, where there's things being assembled, there's packages being packed up and being shipped out. Let's put on our white hats mentality for a second as we basically look at the blueprint of workflows. From what we want to do when we do threat modeling in general, for those that are, I'm assuming that there's a lot of people here that have been exposed to threat modeling, and threat modeling really provides a phenomenal blueprint. Oftentimes people, when they do threat modeling, they think that it's mutually exclusive from other disciplines in security, and that's completely wrong. There's a way in which you can integrate a lot of your existing security disciplines into a threat model, and this is why I basically say that it serves as a phenomenal blueprint for security. If we look at someone that might be managing a very multiple different manufacturing plants, we might have someone that basically says, that more of a business manager or more of a VP of operations, basically saying, concerned with some risk issues. And one of those risk issues might be the information that workflow and that manufacturing entity basically has in terms of information management. So in this particular case, we have an individual who's concerned about information management across the workflows for using it for shipping, using it for product requests that come in and out of her manufacturing plant. There's information sources that are used to basically manage products that are being shipped to different locations, from addresses, commercial addresses, residential addresses. And so, another concern, for when you have this type of workflow, especially like places like Walmart and Amazon, is about continuity. We'll talk about some of the continuity risk in a second, but one additional concern that this individual has is RTO. I can only stay down for about 30 minutes. So when we're looking at things from a threat modeling standpoint, right now I'm speaking about a process as we think about business impact and we go into what's in scope for this particular manufacturing place, is what are the technology assets that basically make it instrumental for me to fulfill my supply chain, my demand cycles, my SLAs with clients. And there's always a concern around asset management. The assets that you have that are your scanners, that are having maybe NFC protocols, that might have integrated capabilities with wearables, that might have integrated capabilities with web technologies and whatnot. As an IT admin for multi-city locations of this type, you have basically an onerous task for asset management. Security hardening rarely happens in these types of places, especially for supply chain, because what's in this type of warehouse oftentimes comes from Siemens, oftentimes comes from Pitney Bowes, oftentimes comes from different manufacturers of technology, Honeywell, that are making you able to ship faster, sort your parcels faster, and do things with greater automation. From an architectural standpoint, there's the concern about function over security. Oftentimes, security architecture is lacking in these types of environments because there is an implicit trust model that exists amongst devices that are being used for these types of environments. From a black hat perspective, if we're going to look at how we can actually offensively attack entities, like a Honeywell or a Pitney Bowes or a Siemens. We'll use the case of the U.S. Postal Service. The U.S. Postal Service has a heavy economic impact to the United States. There's a lot of different economic and downstream impacts it has for the last mile delivery for players like Amazon and Walmart. So we'll look at that. But from a criminal standpoint, there's multiple different questions that we ask ourselves, especially if we build different types of threat models. We want to know about what's in the environment. We want to know about the data source. We want to know about the dependencies that exist. So from a white hat perspective, how do we secure an environment that basically is a huge element in supply chain management? There's a lot of things that obviously can funnel into your threat model. Being able to understand what are the threats that correlate to a specific location, whether it be in Indonesia, whether it be stateside, whether it be in Eastern Europe, what the threat factors for physical, for human collusion, all are going to affect how you threat model these types of environments. What I'm kind of demonstrating here is that there's traditional things that we typically do as security professionals for any type of environment where, we as a white hat, we might scan the environment. We might do our disciplines of, scanning the environment. We might have a threat modeler. Basically, a good threat model will actually take a lot of this vulnerability information and correlate it to the threat analysis for that particular business. Knowing that continuity is king, maybe information management is king, addressing some of the concerns from that manager. And so one of the things that this is kind of like the end result here where we're not at as an industry is being able to leverage threat models that incorporates a lot of different things like asset management, like security hardening, like architectural review as part of a linear process in threat modeling. Now, taking a step back and throwing away the white hat, let's look into understanding some of the threat motives that affect supply chain compromises and why they're so attractive for this day and age. Extremely basic threat motives exist. You have to ask yourselves about what is the intent of the threat motive, what are the rewards, and what is the opportunity for repudiation. The threat actors that we have in these types of evolving supply chain hacks are going to be everything from nation states to hacker syndicates that are basically being subsidized by different countries for different reasons. So as threat modelers, we have to try to do some level of probabilistic analysis to establish that first parent node in our threat model of threat. So oftentimes, in threat modeling, you have libraries, like you have an attack library, you have you might have a weakness library, you might have a threat library. Oftentimes, it's important that this established from the very beginning the impact considerations. In doing so, we can message our threat models better when we are talking to leaders that are going to be subsidizing a lot of the threat modeling activities, security disciplines that affect the organizations that you might be working at. And realize that a lot of you might actually be dependent on supply chain players that are feeding your applications, that are feeding your automotive industries, that are feeding your respective companies. We'll get to that in a second, but right now, when looking at the manufacturer, the key players that are introducing workflow automation and manufacturing components that are going into cars, that are going into stereos, that are going into home electronics, we have to think about what are the impact considerations, and here's 6 of them that really kind of highlight the historic inherent impact considerations for supply chain hacks. So a lot of these impacts, by the way, might be the goals of an adversary. As an example, let's take financial loss. Let's say I'm part of a hacker syndicate. I've been employed by Brazil or China in order to basically discredit a competitive market player in the market as it relates to a new manufacturing device. So establishing downtime, establishing inconsistencies and poor quality in that supply chain, so that I could basically infiltrate that supply chain and get into that competitive product is going to be a key focus. National security is a big concern. So there's in terms of cyber warfare, supply chain, industrial control systems, and transportation means all going to be dependent upon things like delivery of crude oil. They're going to be depending upon scheduling. Scheduling today is managed by complicated systems that are communicating now over mobile applications. So in terms of some of the intricacies of cyber-related warfare, you have opportunities for threat actors to leverage supply chain hacks in order to weaken the social infrastructure of a target entity. In threat modeling, you need a threat library. And this is a threat library here that is basically built for supply chains. There's different goals and objectives that result for each one, beginning with disruption. All of these have been qualified by security research from multiple different locations and entities. Disruption actually, and we'll look at some of the statistics, but if you follow what's been going on in Davos, Switzerland, and some of the other yearly security risk reports that happen at a global level, disruption is actually topping cyber security concerns for international organizations worldwide. So the pace of business is basically like never before, where the pace of business has to fulfill increasing demand in new emerging markets, in India and China. So disruption can be extremely costly. We're going to look at an example with sabotage with USPS as I build a kind of an offensive threat model against the U.S. Postal Service. But here are some other components of a threat library that you can factor in if you're basically doing some level of supply chain threat modeling. Some of these are really no surprise. Espionage as well. So let's talk about espionage. So again, if you want to curtail business development and manufacturing, you want to be able to ideally infiltrate a supply chain for your competitor. It could be in a PLC component. It could be in some level of controller that's on a machine that basically provides some level of reconnaissance of information to that environment. It could be a human asset. Infiltrating the target environment of a supply chain for the purposes of espionage is extremely attractive for international threat actors. There you have the corresponding threat motives for the threat library, and I invite you guys to take note and maybe leverage this within your own respective threat modeling efforts for supply chain. This World Economic Forum provides, I'm just going to basically kind of look at these three triangles right here. So the purple, the orange, and the blue. What I wanted to point out here, this is a 2019 risk census, where thousands of companies were basically asked and what are some of their global risk concerns. And there's multiple sources of this data. Some of it comes from the World Economic Forum, some of it comes from Allianz, some of it comes from major international insurance companies that are actually insuring businesses for different types of risks, everything from cyber to continuity risk and in between. If you look at those three triangles, this is where really it intersects into our field of application security, or asterisk security really in general, because we have some of the kind of the causal factors and consequences that really relate to things like fraud, identity theft, consequences as it relates to advances in technological advancements. This is a good example where the early adoption of technologies in multiple different, in order to achieve economies of scale, allows for implicit trust to exist within these system environments. And implicit trust is a big no-no in any threat model, from an application standpoint to mobile applications to client-server applications. Because of the speed and the nature and the data exchanges that need to happen between A, B, C, D, you have these really pretty simplistic and non-authenticated models that exist. But let's take a look at some of the blue areas. Let's talk about, so you have energy price shock, you have unmanageable inflation, deflation, illicit trade. This might seem non-topical to our lives as security professionals, but with supply chain, if you affect the delivery of services and products, you can actually affect pricing and obviously supply, right? So if you can interrupt and you basically cause that disruption through a supply chain hack, you can actually control some of the demands related to that specific product, maybe to do market manipulation. These are all incentives for orchestrated attacks that take place as we over the next couple of years. I like this diagram a lot because it really shows a lot of the interconnected aspects of cyber attacks with some of the other things that I talked about, the blue triangles and the orange triangles, where you basically, let's talk about industrial control systems. Let's talk about power grids. What are some of these systems, if you worked with bulk energy systems and utility companies that have bulk energy systems, you're not talking about distributed servers. You're talking about complicated, system environments, that are mid-range devices that there's no stage environment. There's no QA environment. You're talking about systems that basically govern energy flows and consumption demand. And so if you basically are looking to establish instability, for socioeconomically through cybercrime attacks, you want to know as an attacker what are the technology components that you can infiltrate, ideally through the supply chain. Because the supply chain offers a phenomenal, if I go back to this slide right here, offers a phenomenal escape for repudiation. Any good hacker wants to get away. So we want to be able to do a supply chain hack in order to establish some level of obscurity to the attack vector that we infiltrated in. This is just another thing, just to kind of add some color. There's a convergence of geopolitical risk themes, and I really want to thank my team that is doing that brought a lot of this data together. But if you look at some of the trends, look at the trends over the past couple of years, and then look and see how cyber attacks have kind of popped up. But what some of the things that are kind of leading in terms of concerns, obviously climate change and stuff like that, but cyber attacks with more regularity have been basically towards the tail end of this time span. And so if we go back to this slide here, cyber attacks, we're going to look at see how cyber attacks can specifically affect supply chains in different industries that can affect economies, social stability, politics, etc. Just a really quick to kind of cap off before we go into our sample threat model this is the report from Allianz. So we looked at the World Economic Forum. What was really interesting to me is to basically look, and these are businesses. These are leaders that are running multinational companies worldwide, and they're basically, cyber incidents are definitely a concern, but business interruption now is a concern because it's costing them so much money. So when we, for many of you that don't know me, I'm the author of the Process for Attack Simulation and Threat Analysis. It's a risk-centric threat modeling methodology. And when you're talking about threat models, it's important to kind of convey what's at stake. What's the impact of your application threat model? If unmitigated, what's going to be the ultimate impact to product assurance, to market growth, and other types of things that businesses are concerned about. So let's dive into this USPS threat model. Interesting things about the USPS that maybe many of you don't know is that handles more mail than any postal system in the world. It's really interesting stuff. Many of us know the U.S. postal system to be, we always hear about stories about they're financially unstable, and that's true. They are financially unstable, and in recent news, you've heard a lot about the White House criticizing Amazon for their exploitation of USPS in order to save money, and USPS not making ends meet in some of their last mile deliveries. But let's talk about how many businesses, how many lives are affected. And as we go through this model, we want to kind of embrace more of a black hat type of mentality. What can we do if we're a nation state, or let's say, actually, so there's a couple different threat models and trees that you can build, but you can talk about social disruption, which basically, when you do social disruption, your intent is to consume resources and financial resources so that they can fix a problem that you've created as an offensive, as a defensive attacker. Traditionally, the largest provider of last mile delivery in the United States, that is rapidly changing. I like to build these types of kind of like high-level depictions for our teams do this for a lot of our clients, and so that they can kind of understand the threat research that is specific. So you always want to have a threat library. Whether you're doing application threat modeling or organizational threat modeling, you want to be able to understand what are the threats that are research-backed, that are incident-backed, And so these are the things that are basically italicized are pretty much anybody can be affected. You know, there's, I mean, everyone from Netflix to Amazon, you have an opportunity for crypto mining to take place, cryptojacking, that sort of thing. But specific to the U.S. Postal Service, these sort of things really hurt. Exfiltration of PII, that's actually happened. You know, Krebs on Security reported multiple different instances of that. 60 million records were accidentally disclosed. Harvesting employee information. The Secret Service has found out that, and this is an actual incident that happened, that foreign adversaries basically infiltrated the USPS in order to gain basically the identities of USPS workers for unknown reasons that the Secret Service doesn't quite understand just yet. But in terms of impersonation, I mean, any good cyber criminal wants to have multiple handles, right? You want to have multiple different personalities and acquire different credentials in order to work in logical means as well as physical means. Sabotage is the one that we're actually going to play with. So we're going to play with the sabotage parent threat node in our threat model. And kind of walking through, so it goes from threat library to understanding threat motives and kind of understanding the attack surface. This is extremely high level. If we were actually, all of us today, working at the U.S. Postal Service, we would want to understand, you know, obviously in greater detail, what are the endpoints that are basically, you know, in direct line of fire to attack patterns that support these threats. What are, you know, so here's some more specific examples, these mail sorters. These AFCS systems, which they basically are reading with tiny little cameras the postage and the address label in order to do directing, and then they basically feed that to the sorters. You know, these are machines that are like, you know, half a football field in length that are processing parcels, flats, and letters for the entire country. Again, USPS, the largest processor of mail for all the world combined, is just here in the United States. So we look at this, you know, what we want to do is be able to understand what is the attack surface, what's at stake, and then understand what attack patterns, and granted, this is just a few. There could be, your attack library, you know, could be, you know, 10 times this. But at the, you know, when you do threat modeling, we all know that you're not going to cover everything. You want to cover the most likely types of threats that are substantiated by evidence. And, you know, at the end here is basically being able to understand what are some of the mitigations that you have as countermeasures. Supply chain, you know, in these machines, in these delivery bar mail sorters and other types of devices that are in this environment, you have components. You have components that are manufactured by multiple different players, Vantage systems from Pitney Bowes, Siemens parts, PLC boards that are from different manufacturers, all of which that definitely the U.S. Postal Service has not vetted programmatically, the firmware, none of that. Also, there's no architectural review for looking at the dependencies and what sort of dependencies exist between components to other components in the same machine or other machines. From an impact standpoint, you know, this is a very important piece of machinery, and it was recently updated nationwide a couple years ago, but it basically does these functions. And the reason I'm bringing this in is because it's important that when we do threat modeling that you understand the context of impact if something were to have, you know, downtime. Another key one is the advanced facer cancellation system. Basically, that's the blueprint of it, and this is the one that's kind of like, you know, extremely large. It's like half of the length of a football field. It has multiple different PLC boards that rely on software and firmware to do things like, you know, lift different levers up and handles up. And if any one of those things go wrong, there's downtime. So, you know, why would you want to create downtime as an attacker? Well, you know, well, first of all, going to the actual, you know, attack vector, largely for this threat model that we're doing on sabotage, is being able to get access to the code, taint the code from the purveyor of those parts. So you don't do this, you wouldn't do this as a USPS worker and basically, you know, try to, you know, taint the code that way. You would basically, as a supply chain, you would look to the manufacturer of those PLC boards and see if you can introduce some malicious code or some rogue code in order to do arbitrary, you know, types of commands. The thing about these types of devices that are embedded in this example is that there's open trust boundaries to other colors or storage components. And so there is no level of validation. That provides a great, especially if we think about, let's talk about what happened. I'm from Atlanta. Atlanta was on the map in terms of the ransomware incident that happened that brought the city down. It was a $50,000 ransom, and they basically spent millions of dollars in rectifying their issue, which they actually knew about 3 years prior. So from a supply chain standpoint, the city of Atlanta has systems that do imaging for your driver's license. They have systems that basically are responsible for managing ticket information that the city offers in terms of parking fines, et cetera. There's all these different software, hardware, and oftentimes code off the shelf that's basically being consumed by someone like the city of Atlanta. In this case, we're talking about very simplistic code that is doing certain operators in order to control the function of some of those large machines. Ultimately, when we do threat modeling, you need to do some attack trees. Most people, when they do threat modeling, they might stop at DFDs. DFDs are great from a white hat perspective, but in order to truly have an adversarial exercise, you want to be able to, if you've built a threat library that basically includes some of the things that I mentioned right here, this threat library right here, you want to be able to create an attack tree for each one of these nodes. And your attack tree might vary if you're in different industries. So you want to be able to create an attack tree that has a threat node for each one of these things, and then build it out in order that it looks something like this. Now, remember when I was talking about that manufacturing plant where the manager was concerned about things like regulatory information and because of GDPR, and there's information going into her warehouse. So she's concerned about business impact liability. How do you basically take some of those other disciplines that I mentioned into an attack tree? The reason I love attack trees is because if you're a pen tester, or if you pay someone to do pen testing, well, pay them to do, they might do breadth of coverage, they might do their general scans or whatever, but get them to do adversarial exercises against this. Because this is supported, again, by information that is threat research. So we see some things here, sabotage. This might be, disgruntled employees, like that's never happened in the USPS, right? Sorting systems, this is the sorting system that we talked about earlier. These are some components that are actually in these systems. These components actually have open vulnerabilities. You want to use libraries like CVE, phenomenal library, for systems, right? CVEs are great for infrastructure vulnerabilities, system vulnerabilities, platform vulnerabilities, code off the shelf type stuff. CWEs are good stuff for stuff that you might be coding. But you map these to the affected components, and then you test the exploitation of that vulnerability with a certain attack vector. What this does from a risk standpoint is that basically it provides a probabilistic analysis to viability. Is it possible, so if my goal, is sabotage, these are the things, these are my target components that I want to sabotage. These vulnerabilities happen to all relate to denial of service. And let's say for my intent for a sabotage attack is just simply to cost the company money because I'm sick and tired of them. They didn't give me a Christmas bonus, or I'm sick, I've been working there for 25 years, I'm just getting it to it from the man or whatever. But these are all vulnerabilities that can help realize, and these are all CAPEX that are, from a organization of your threat model. It helps to organize and map your attack patterns to your weaknesses, your vulnerabilities. Now, from a black hat perspective, let's think about other things besides the USPS. We want to, let's say we're all getting paid a lot of money in order to just be cyber criminals and think about the next possible attack. We have to, typically the goals are, we want to steal data, we want to do any of these things, which basically reflect a lot of the threat library. There's a lot of intel, and this is where a lot of the non-AppSec stuff comes in, because as you look for major players in supply chain components, you basically have a lot of gratis information in terms of what you want to hit. based upon where this player is in your target. Supply chain hacking really comes to not about hacking Pitney Bowes, but it's about leveraging Pitney Bowes into where Pitney Bowes is actually implemented in. Because we want to get to the target environment. Maybe we want to establish persistence there, which should be here. Yeah, I want to live in someone's environment and I don't want to move out. Maybe I want persistence. Maybe one of their devices allows me to do that. Maybe I want to steal data. Well, they got some APIs. Some of them relates to customer information APIs. In thinking in this way, this is offensive because you're putting the parts together. You're putting the threat analysis together. You're putting the offensive mindset together. What's interesting on this site is that, I often, what's interesting on this site is that basically you have a great resource for criminals is to basically look and see who they're in bed with. And, Pitney Bowes, we want to do supply chain hacking. So, there's a municipality right here. And here's another municipality. Municipalities are great. On the heels of what happened to Atlanta, where they paid and it worked, actually, where they didn't pay, but with the opportunity where you can actually lock up their devices and get, maybe you lower your cost down from $50,000 to $25,000. But if you do that with enough, or $10,000, this is cyber criminal economics. So picking your target selection can actually just come from simple OSINT. And again, we're not attacking Pitney Bowes. We're trying to leverage and see are these entities. And if you read it, I'm not going to bore you by reading this. If you read these little blurbs on customer attestations, they're actually telling you what products they're actually using. Now, one of the things that, we have a SecOps team, what we like to do is we like to build this attack surface tool. This is a very simplistic tool, but anytime it's a tool that constantly, as a cyber criminal, you always want to collect information all the time, 24 hours a day about a target. Because you never know when there's going to be a new dump, or there's going to be a new interface, an open up port or something. And so you want to get alerted and stuff like that. This is actually happening. Cyber criminals are doing the same way. Just like they're harvesting data and creating, and trading data, they're also trading OSINT information about where they want to get into, of which includes supply chain components that are being used in a target entity. So it's important from a black hat perspective to understand, what is the attack surface that you want to hit. You want to understand and enumerate the APIs, the hardware components that might have, embedded PLCs that you can basically use. If you can get access to the boards that have these PLCs, then physical security of these places, and this is why credentialing and impersonation is really important. To get into these environments, compromise the supply and taint the actual code base so that they can be shipped out. And imagine if a lot of these boards have small processing power and small logical spaces, but as those components get bigger and stronger, think about the possibilities of broader botnets and obviously opportunities for extortion. So in workflow automations that exist especially in manufacturing, there's some inherent weaknesses that as cyber criminals we can take, they can take advantage of. And basically it's understanding some of the components that we can compromise from an offensive model. Knowing that there's controllers and human machine interfaces and intra-process communications that exist. We want to be able to get into these areas because this is a great tier to get into for repudiation. If we can infiltrate the supply chain of these devices, of these components, then it allows us to basically affect the inner operations of these components to other systems. So there's some things that are advantageous for the offensive threat modeler, or the offensive attacker, better said, is that there's an implicit trust model that exists between these components, between systems. Right now there's no assurance program. A lot of the products that are being shipped out, there is no security assurance that provides any level of guarantee or security assurance that the authenticity of the code, or that the code has been tested with any sort of form of security regimen. From a code standpoint, there's also no validation. Oftentimes, even some of the updates. I think I had this screen right here. Yeah. So this particular example where it's there's an actual, you can actually get access to the actual code base. It's not an SDK, but you can basically look at the code base for this that goes into Vantage from Siemens, and there's no validation on, there's no like digital things used like digital certs. There's no validation on that it's coming from Siemens. Oftentimes you have, even in the components that you have going into these machines, you have different manufacturers that are adding their own components to that machine. So it's difficult to provide a level of assurance on the code. So typically when you're doing a data flow diagram with these types of pretty simplistic machines where you're going back to the USPS, where they're doing sorting, where they're doing tagging, where they're scanning barcodes and stuff like that, you have a lot of the requests, you have a lot of the IPCs that are just simply acting and sending signals. That's all they're doing. And so it's very simplistic code base. So there's no validation, there's no need for it, because you're really focused on speed and function. So inherently, these types of conditions exist to basically make it easier for abuse in these types of manufacturing environments in the supply chain. Sustaining threats, or substantiating threats, better said, I talked about this earlier, is how do you basically quantify or qualify that a threat is actually something that should make it part of your threat library. I bring this up because this was covered, but there's multiple different cases from the FBI, and there's the I forgot the name of the bureau. That's actually a federal entity that governs mail in the United States. It's not the USPS, obviously, but they also have other incidents where the USPS information or infrastructure was compromised. You want to take that information and you want to build it into your threat model so that you can do some level of probabilistic analysis. Probabilistic analysis is this is one of the most simplest ways to actually look at it, is to see what sort of events have actually occurred for the threat model you're trying to build versus the possible outcomes. So in the case of sabotage, we would have to look, there hasn't been any cyber-related documented cases on sabotage in the USPS, but there has been sabotage by employees before. So at what point, so there has been events that relates to that threat, but we have to actually also do the permutation for the possible outcomes as it relates to cyber-related attacks. From a white hat perspective, there's things that we can do in order to leverage threat models as a blueprint. We can wrap, oftentimes when we do any level of security assurance, we have, there's been numerous times where I've been told that, we don't do threat modeling, we do pen testing. We don't do threat modeling, we do static analysis. We don't do, and they kind of make them mutually exclusive. And what I'm saying here is that you can build a threat model that actually incorporates, like, let's say those two activities to basically reflect the attack viability on pen testing, and then what's wrong, from a vulnerability analysis, you can basically rope that into your vulnerability assessment part of your threat model. If you engage in bug bounties or zero-day development with different research firms, you could also see what is the likelihood and possibility of 0 days being developed against particular assets that are in your attack surface. So prescriptive guidance from a white hat perspective is when you're doing threat modeling, and we'll go over, PASTA in a second here, is the process for attack simulation and threat analysis, is that you want to be able to clearly understand the attack surface for if you work for a major manufacturer, or if you are a player in the supply chain for multiple different industries, you want to be able to understand what is the attack surface. That basically is going to be in direct line of sight to those threat motives and that threat library that you build. You also want to go ahead and address some regulatory drivers that affect the environment that you have, because it's not just the risk of cyber impact and downtime and information compromise. It's also the risks of if that data gets compromised, what additional impacts from a regulatory sense are going to be tacked on. These are some prescriptive guidance things that are pretty self-explanatory. It's difficult to implement a lot of these things in certain environments because hardening, for example, might deprecate function in different types of environments. But you can take this as a prescriptive checklist to do for environments where you're a manufacturer or part of a supply chain model. I'm not really big of a fan of Gartner, but I put it on here just because there's a lot of people in security live and die by what Gartner says, and my point here in introducing this particular quote from June of last year is that attacks are extremely sophisticated in supply chain. It's not just with web applications. There's a lot of people talking about data filtration or even with like financial systems like botnets. But with supply chain, you can have multiple different kind of chain threats that are working together. The current risk environment is quickly evolving, and we all need to stay abreast in terms of geopolitical changes that are going to actually be kind of contributors to the threats from the threat library that I covered earlier on. 2017 saw a dramatic rise in supply chain attacks over the previous year, 200% increase. Typical attacks cost $1.1 million. If you look at the supply chain attacks from going back 20 years, a lot of it is affecting cost of goods sold. A lot of it is still affecting continuity, but it's physical. Now with physical, it's easier to basically have non-repudiation. Cameras, people getting caught, etc. With cyber, it's a lot more difficult, and so the opportunity exists for infiltrating components that are in part of a bigger product into the supply chain that will never get looked at, but that is actually recording information, stealing IP, etc. Offensive intel to consider. These are things that are being currently carried out by offensive teams. So I already mentioned this before. Similar to aggregating PII, there's entities that are sharing OSINT information. Think of it like Salesforce for hackers. Target entity, all the human assets, all the target infrastructure, all the software, harvest, so that you can basically share that information. Because criminals realize that in sharing the information, they can still leverage that information in order to do their distinctive threat objectives, whether it be stealing information, stealing IP, or bringing someone down. It's important to map your threat objectives to your attack surface. I already mentioned that. One quick mention before we go. This is my thought on Stride. If you're doing any form of advanced threat modeling, I couldn't. This picture really spoke to me because it basically takes people that want to do threat modeling and says you only have 6 choices. You're in finance, you only have 6 choices. 6. It's a mnemonic for classifying your threats. Well, you're in manufacturing. You're in petro. You got 6 choices. It doesn't make any rational sense. You can't also factor in so many different things that I've just talked about. You can't factor in threat intel, threat data from your own environment. You can't factor in probabilistic risk analysis. All of these geopolitical risk themes, you can't do anything with it. If you're learning about it and you're in high school, sure, Stride is great, but it's been around. It needs to be replaced. And if you're using it, look to evolve beyond what you're doing. Otherwise, you're going to find yourself in a world of hurt if you're riding this ride. So I only have 5 minutes left, but I wanted to just, these slides will be posted on SpeakerDeck. This is the process for attack simulation and threat analysis. I basically walked through, in the very beginning, I talked about impact of the business as it relates to information loss or loss of continuity. It begins with understanding impact. It begins by, it follows that with an attack surface understanding. It basically follows that with trying to see how components are working together from a functional standpoint. And then it goes more black hat, where it's like, what are the threats that are affecting, any given target entity or process or whatever. So this will be available so that you guys can look at it in more detail. Second to last slide really quick is some prescriptive guidance. If you're building a supply chain threat model, is that, hey, leverage a risk-based approach. Take a look at the process for attack simulation and threat analysis. Qualify threats and incorporate it into your model. Substantiate threats with real threat intel and threat data. Classifying threats from a software manufacturer is not going to do you any good if you're in government or if you're in military. Architecture, the type of risk-centric threat modeling also allows you to factor in environmental attack patterns or physical attack patterns or other non-application related attack patterns. My last parting words here is to simply, I always say to a lot of people, don't be a kind of a security sheep. Oftentimes we especially in AppSec, there's probably obviously we're extremely technical in terms of programming backgrounds and whatnot, less of the auditor types, but even still in our OWASP circles, we have a tendency to say, hey, this is what Oracle is doing. Oracle, phenomenal software, but and also talking about supply chain is in your supply chain, but their guidance for let's say if they had a guidance for threat modeling, and right now I'm talking about Microsoft, won't really correlate to what you might be doing in terms of like IoT product development or government services and things like that. If you are interested in the risk-centric threat modeling process for attack simulation, it's a book that I co-wrote with another OWASP leader from London. His name was Marco Morana. He was SVP of fraud over there for Citi. And we co-wrote this book in 2015. We spent about 7 years researching different threat modeling methodologies and approaches. And our main focus was, let's do something that actually identifies risk and correlates threat intel. So I also run the Atlanta chapter in OWASP. I've been affiliated with OWASP now for 10 years. And if you have any questions about the presentation, I know I kind of only have 40 minutes to kind of run through it, but my contact information is there at Twitter and LinkedIn, and I'll be available for any questions that you guys might have. Yes?
So in the supply chain threat model, have you seen a movement in contract negotiations to include threat modeling requirements and assurances of any kind?
Nope. Unfortunately, not yet. Nope. The contract negotiations is getting an injection with GDPR with sub-processors. And so the sub-processors also include manufacturers of software and anything else that can process information. So that's injecting some life into the scrutiny that needs to happen, but nothing that basically explicitly says, hey, do threat modeling. Yes?
Quick question. I just looked up your book. It looks like it's really, really interesting. Unfortunately, on Amazon, it looks like it's $100.
Yeah. I don't know why so I have discount codes. Yeah. There's a couple of cheaper ways to get it. Yeah, so I have a discount code. So if you want a discount code, I should have put it up before. I'll tweet it out, or if you follow me, I'll tweet it out, or you can just send me an email to Tony. I have two emails, the same TonyUV@VerSprite.com, TonyUV@OWASP.org. You can shoot me an email, and I'll give you the discount code. So apologize for that. Wiley is a good publisher, but they need to pay for their New York office space, I guess.
Have you done any threat analysis for, or has anybody looking to move to multi-cloud come up to you and asked for a threat analysis, and have you had to adjust your model for that?
Yeah, so the big CSPs out there are especially like Amazon, they have their own internal teams, but I don't think they're looking at some of these geopolitical risk themes, because right now more and more adoption of cloud CSP players is definitely going to be key. So you even look at Salesforce. Salesforce provides obviously a faceplate to applications for startups that want to be able to use the Salesforce front end and the Salesforce back end. So there's Salesforce IoT, platforms and stuff like that. But talk about a supply chain impact. So from a criminal standpoint, phenomenal way to extort. If I as an attacker want to hold a CSP hostage and all their tenants, I could charge $5K a pop, a tenant, and that might be a type of price point that they don't even blink at. But it's with cloud operations. I think that it requires the adversary to have a lot more intel on how those operations work, and that's actually happening. So a lot of our, some of our relations are with some CSP providers, and there are signs that they're trying to basically, gather intel and harvest information, gather employee information for impersonation, So these are all non-application related things, but they basically funnel into the overall application threat model.